A dress that costs £9 to make, hanging in a British shop window right now for £180. You've worn that label to a wedding, a job interview, maybe this week without a second thought. The deception isn't the price. It's one seam, one loose thread, one label you've been trained, quite deliberately, never to check. 12 brands today, 7 fleecing you politely, 5 earning every penny. And the worst offender, decades spent convincing you it's practically bespoke. It isn't, not remotely. Hobbs built its reputation on being the brand your mother trusted, and your grandmother before her. Tailored coats, sensible shoes with a bit of flair, the sort of blouse you'd wear to a christening and keep folded in tissue paper for a decade after. That reputation still opens wallets today, decades on. The construction inside those wallets doesn't quite earn it anymore, and that gap is precisely what this entry is about. A Hobbs coat today will run you £250 to £350. 20 years ago, that price bought you wool, with real weight to it, the kind that held its shape across a shoulder without help, that smelled faintly of lanolin when it was new, that you could feel settle around you like a proper garment rather than a costume. It bought a canvas interlining sewn in by hand, seams finished at the edges rather than simply overlocked and left. Now, a meaningful portion of the range has quietly slipped into polyester wool blends, sometimes as little as 40% wool, occasionally less, with fusible interlining doing the shaping work that used to be stitched in by a machinist who knew what she was doing. Fusing is cheaper, it's faster, it requires no skilled labour beyond operating a heat press, and it bubbles at the lapel and the collar after enough dry cleaning cycles, in a way that hand-set canvas simply never does. A fault line that appears roughly 18 months to 2 years in. Right around the point, you'd assumed the coat had settled rather than begun to fail. The brand hasn't changed its prices to reflect any of this. It's changed its factories instead, shifting a large share of production to lower-cost manufacturing across Asia, while keeping the British heritage language exactly where it was in the marketing copy. The same soft-focus photography of English countryside, the same timeless and considered vocabulary that implied a level of craft the current supply chain simply doesn't deliver. You're still paying for the story. The stitching underneath tells a rather different one if you're willing to look for it. Mint velvet sells a feeling, that slightly undone, expensive-looking ease that reads as effortless on Instagram and in the shop's soft, deliberately forgiving lighting. It's a genuinely clever brand, and there's no shame in admitting it works. The styling is excellent, the photography is better, the shops themselves are designed to feel like a friend's exceptionally well-appointed dressing room, rather than a retail floor. But pick up the actual garment, away from the lighting and the mood board aesthetic, and something changes rather quickly. A huge proportion of the mint velvet range, the jumpers especially, but increasingly the dresses and separates too, is viscose, polyester, or a blend of both, dressed up in a drape and a muted colour palette that photographs like cashmere and silk under the right conditions. A luxe jumper at £89 will frequently contain no wool at all, despite sitting on a rail beside genuinely woolen pieces priced only slightly higher, which does rather a lot of quiet work in making the synthetic option feel like reasonable value by comparison. The fabric is soft to the touch on day one, admittedly. That's not in dispute. By month 3, after a handful of washes, it's pilled at the underarm and along the hem, and it's lost the drape that sold it to you in the changing room in the first place. None of this is illegal, and Mint Velvet never technically claims to be a luxury fibre brand. Read the small print, and it's all there. If you know to look for percentages rather than adjectives, but the pricing, often £70 to £150 for garments built substantially from synthetic fabric, assumes you won't check the label and relies on the fact that most women, quite reasonably, don't. They're buying a feeling and a fit, not a fibre composition. That's rather the entire point of the exercise. Phase 8 has cornered a specific and lucrative market. The wedding guest, the mother of the bride, the woman who needs to look genuinely extraordinary for one particular Saturday and is willing, understandably, to pay handsomely for the privilege of not thinking about it twice. And the prices reflect that captive, emotionally loaded moment. £150 to £300 for occasion. Wear that on the hanger under shop lighting looks entirely special. Here's what's actually happening underneath the embellishment once you get past the beading and the drape. The base fabric on the majority of Phase 8's occasion dresses is polyester chiffon or polyester crepe, high street material, functionally identical to what you'd find at a fraction of the price on the cheaper rails of the very same shopping centre. What you're actually paying the premium for is the beading, the embroidery, the styling detail applied on top of that base cloth. And to be fair, that's a legitimate cost. Hand-applied beadwork takes genuine time and genuine skill, and someone, somewhere, is being paid for those hours. But the brand lets the finished silhouette do all the talking, and most customers, understandably given the context in which they're buying, assume that a finish this impressive must mean fabric quality runs all the way through the garment. It doesn't. Strip away the sequins and the clever draping, and you're holding a polyester dress that cost the brand very little to source in the first place, dressed quite literally to justify a price point built for a once-a-year, emotional purchase made by a woman who has very little appetite, on the day itself, to interrogate a fabric label. Karen Millen occupies a strange and rather specific place in the British wardrobe hierarchy, a brand that women reliably describe as a step up, without always being able to say precisely what it's a step up from. The tailoring silhouette is sharp, unapologetically so. The prices, £120 to £250 for dresses and jackets, sit confidently, almost defiantly, in premium territory, as though daring you to question them. The trouble is what's happened to the brand across its multiple ownership changes, and particularly since its move into the Boohoo Group's stable. Production has consolidated into much the same fast fashion supply chains used across the group's other considerably cheaper labels, just cut in a sharper shape and priced substantially higher on the strength of the name alone. Fabric composition on core dresses frequently runs heavy on polyester and elastane, rather than the structured, higher percentage wool or viscose crepe blends the brand built its name on back in the 1990s and 2000s, when a Karen Millen dress genuinely did signal something different from the high street around it. The bodycon silhouette hides a great deal, and it's worth saying that plainly. Stretch fabric is forgiving of thinner construction. A tight seam looks sharp, regardless of what's actually sewn into it, and elastane does most of the visual work that used to belong to proper tailoring. But wear one of these pieces for a full evening, in heat, on a dance floor, under the particular stress that a night out puts on a garment, and you'll notice precisely what the shape was concealing. You paid for the cut. The cloth underneath it is doing considerably less than the price tag would have you believe. Ted Baker has spent 30 years positioning itself as Britain's witty, slightly eccentric answer to the more serious continental fashion houses. Playful prints, elaborate packaging that turns unboxing into a small event, a shop experience that feels like a prop from a particularly well-dressed period drama. Women's dresses in the £150 to £280 range trade almost entirely on that identity. And it's a genuinely well-built identity, which is precisely why it's worth interrogating. Here's what the price is actually buying once you look past the branding. The core fabric, a polyester elastane blend across the vast majority of the printed dress range, carries a landed manufacturing cost that industry analysts place at roughly £12 to £18 per garment. The remainder is brand infrastructure, and there's rather a lot of it to fund. The flagship stores in prime locations, the whimsical swing tags with their little in-jokes, a licensing empire that now stretches from luggage to fragrance to homeware, all of it needing to be paid for somewhere along the supply chain. Ted Baker is not, at its core, a fashion house in the traditional sense. It is a marketing operation that happens as a secondary function to make dresses. The construction rather confirms it, if you're paying attention. Zips are frequently the cheapest available grade and fail within a year of regular wear, sticking or splitting at precisely the moment you least want them to. Seam allowances are narrow, which means very little room for alteration down the line, and a meaningfully higher risk of the seam simply giving way under normal wear. You're not paying for a better-made dress than its high-street equivalent. You're paying for the label, the box, the little bird motif, and the feeling of having bought into something clever and distinctly British, which is entirely fine, as long as you know going in that's the actual transaction on the table. Reiss has pulled off something genuinely impressive, convincing a large swathe of professional British women that it occupies the space just below true luxury, a rung above the high street, and a rung below anything you'd need to save for. The stores are minimalist and considered, all pale wood and confident lighting. The price points, £180 for a dress, £250 for a blazer. Whisper quality without quite shouting it, which is itself a rather deliberate piece of positioning. Look closer though, and the whisper starts to falter under scrutiny. Reiss tailoring, particularly since the brand's partial acquisition by Next, has leaned increasingly on fused rather than sewn construction for its jackets and structured dresses. Fusing glues the interlining to the shell fabric instead of stitching it in by hand. Cheaper to produce, considerably faster to manufacture at scale, and, crucially, prone to bubbling once heat and humidity get properly to it. A summer wedding spent mostly outdoors. A conference with too little hanging space overnight in a hotel room. The shape starts to go visibly along the lapel and across the chest, and once it's gone, it doesn't come back. No amount of steaming or pressing restores fused interlining once it's begun to separate. The dresses fare little better under the same scrutiny. Fabric weights are frequently lighter than they present under shop lighting. Deliberately so, because retail lighting is theatre, and Reiss understands that better than almost anyone on the high street. You are, quite often, buying the atmosphere of the shop itself rather than the garment you walk out with. The brand looks like quiet money, dressed the part entirely. It isn't always made like it, and the difference tends to reveal itself roughly a year in, right when you'd assumed you were past the point of disappointment. All Saints has built an entire aesthetic around distressed leather, moody lighting, and rock and roll authenticity. And on one specific product, that authenticity is entirely, unambiguously earned. The leather jacket, genuine, well-sourced, properly constructed, and worth every one of the roughly £300 to £400 it costs. No caveats required. If this list stopped there, All Saints wouldn't be on it at all. Everything else on the rail, however, is a rather different story. Step away from leather and into the cotton tees, the knitwear, the printed dresses, and you're looking at fabric and construction that would sit entirely comfortably on a high street rail at a third of the price. A £90 t-shirt built from broadly the same weight cotton jersey as a £15 basic sold 2 doors down. A £150 jumper in an acrylic wool blend with barely enough actual wool content to register on the label, let alone justify the price. What All Saints has done, rather cleverly, is let the reputation earned by one genuinely exceptional product, the jacket, cast a halo over an entire range that hasn't remotely earned the same trust. You walk into the shop trusting the leather, because that trust is well placed and well documented. You walk out having paid leather jacket adjacent prices for a cotton t-shirt, because the shop itself, the lighting, the moody photography on every wall, doesn't distinguish between the two. Unless you're leaving specifically with the jacket, you are, in all likelihood, paying for a brand identity that one genuinely excellent product built entirely on its own, and everything else on the rail is simply coasting on its reputation, quite comfortably, at your expense. Before we move to the brands actually worth your money, and there are some genuinely wonderful ones on this next list, if you're enjoying this, hit subscribe and tap that notification bell. We cover British style, British craft, and British life properly, every single week, without the fluff and without the sponsored nonsense that clutters up so much of this space. And if you've been caught out by any of the 7 brands we've just covered, tell us in the comments which one stung the most. This community has excellent taste and even better opinions, and honestly, the comments section on these videos is half the fun of making them. Down in Cornwall, Celtic Co has built its entire identity around a genuinely unfashionable idea that clothes should be made from what they say they're made from and last considerably longer than the receipt. This is the natural fibre specialist, and it means it literally. Sheepskin sourced and tanned to traceable standards. Wool duffel coats woven from British fleece. Cotton knitwear without the synthetic filler that pads out so much of the high street's cotton blend labelling. A Celtic and Cummer sheepskin coat at £300 to £450 isn't cheap, but the sheepskin is genuine, full grain, and built to be reconditioned rather than replaced. The kind of garment you take to a specialist for a clean rather than a bin for a landfill. There's nothing flashy about the brand. No elaborate marketing, no celebrity collaborations. Just fibre, Honestly sourced, honestly priced. In an industry built on concealment, that plainness is close to radical. Baukjen occupies the space that mint velvet only pretends to. Genuinely elevated, everyday essentials, built with a sustainability commitment that goes considerably beyond the marketing language. A Baukjen dress or knit, typically £120 to £200, is overwhelmingly made from natural or recycled fibres. Organic cotton, responsibly sourced wool, tencel where synthetics are unavoidable. The brand publishes its supply chain in detail: factory locations, working conditions, fabric certifications. Nothing hidden, nothing you have to take on trust. What that transparency buys you practically is longevity. Baukjen pieces are cut generously, seamed properly, and built from fabric with enough structural integrity to survive repeated washing without losing shape. Women who buy into the brand tend to stay loyal for years, which is, in an industry built on constant turnover, the quietest possible endorsement. Scottish knitwear has an international reputation built over centuries, and Brora is one of the few remaining brands that still honours it in full. A Brora cashmere jumper, £180 to £350, depending on weight and construction, is spun and knitted using cashmere sourced through long-standing relationships with Mongolian and Scottish mills, then finished in the Scottish borders using techniques that haven't fundamentally changed since the 19th century. The yarn is heavier than you'll find in fast fashion cashmere because it isn't diluted with synthetic filler to stretch the fibre further. This is investment knitwear in the literal sense. A well-cared for Brora jumper will outlast a decade of washing, holding its shape and softness in a way that thinner, blended cashmere simply cannot. You are paying for the fibre, the mill, and the generations of expertise behind both, and every one of those things is genuinely there. Margaret Howell has spent nearly 50 years making a quiet argument that most of the fashion industry has ignored, that restraint, properly executed, is worth more than embellishment. Prices sit high, £200 to £500 for core pieces, and they're justified by fabric sourced from some of Europe's most respected mills, cut with a precision that produces the label's signature, clean, architectural silhouette. Cotton poplin shirts are woven to a weight and finish that most brands reserve for their most expensive lines. Wool coats use cloth from mills that have supplied Savile Row for generations. There is nothing trend-driven here, which is exactly the point. Margaret Howell pieces are bought to be worn for 15 years, not one season, and the construction, proper seam finishing, natural fibres throughout, buttons that don't crack, reflects that intention completely. This is quiet luxury in the truest sense. No logo doing the talking, just craftsmanship that speaks for itself. And at the very top, the brand that has quietly become the gold standard for modern British women's wear, ME+EM. Founded in 2013, ME+EM built its entire proposition around a single promise: premium fabric, considered tailoring, and construction that justifies every pound of a £150 to £350 price range. The brand designs collections to work as a wardrobe system rather than disposable trend pieces, and the fabric sourcing backs that promise up. Italian wool, French lace, technical fabrics developed specifically for the brand rather than bought off a generic mill list. The tailoring is where ME+EM truly separates itself. Blazers use proper canvas construction where competitors at the same price point fuse. Seams are finished to a standard you'd expect considerably higher up the price ladder. And critically, the brand has resisted the seasonal churn that erodes quality elsewhere. Pieces are designed to be repurchased as staples, not replaced as trends, which means the incentive to cut corners simply isn't there in the way it is for brands chasing next season's turnover. This is what worth every penny actually looks like. Not the loudest branding, not the biggest marketing budget, just fabric, construction, and intention, all pointed in the same honest direction. If this has changed how you're looking at what's currently hanging in your own wardrobe, good. That's precisely the point of sitting down with us for 20 minutes rather than scrolling past. Britain's Best exists because British craft, British heritage, and British life deserve to be taken seriously and explained properly. Not simplified for the sake of a shorter video, not packaged into something unrecognizable just to chase an algorithm. Properly, the way these subjects actually deserve. If you're new here, subscribe now and tap that notification bell. Every week we go deep into estates, into history, into craft, into the quietly extraordinary things that make this island what it is, well beyond what fits neatly into a title. And leave us a comment. Which of these brands have you spent good money on over the years? Which ones surprised you today, for better or worse? The conversation in the comments is, frankly, half the reason to be here, and we read every single one. We'll see you next time. Dress well, buy less, buy better.